Behind the palace doors, the monarchy was confronting a problem nobody could solve with tradition alone. There were too many expectations, too many relatives, and too few working royals carrying the burden. And according to Louise's account, that pressure created a brutal question: who still truly belonged inside the crown's future? For years, the idea of a smaller monarchy had sounded almost sensible. Fewer working royals could mean clearer roles, tighter control, and less confusion over who officially represented the crown. From an institutional point of view, it looked clean, efficient, modern, but royal families are not corporations, and the people being moved around on paper are not simply names on an organizational chart. They are sons, daughters, cousins, parents, and grandchildren. Every decision about duty carries an emotional cost, especially when someone begins to realize that their future may be quietly decided before they are even invited into the conversation. Louise, in particular, stood in an awkward place. She belonged to a younger generation whose role had never been fully defined. Some of her royal cousins had already built independent lives beyond the daily structure of monarchy, creating careers, families, and identities that did not depend on palace responsibility. Louise had taken a similarly quiet path, but there was one important difference: she had never appeared to reject the institution. She had not demanded greater status, fought publicly for a title, or tried to turn her royal connection into constant attention. That was what made the possibility of being pushed further away feel especially harsh. She had followed the quiet path everyone seemed to want, only to discover that her silence might now be used as proof that she was unnecessary. Edward and Sophie had spent years trying to give their children something rare inside royal life: privacy without complete separation. They performed duties, carried expectations, and remained close to the institution while allowing Louise to grow without being placed permanently under the brightest royal spotlight. Yet that careful balance may have created an unintended problem. Palace planners could now point to Louise's private life and ask whether the public truly needed another formal royal figure at all. According to the growing internal logic, a confidential assessment was beginning to take shape around the younger generation. Who could realistically support the crown in 10 years? 20 years? Who would be dependable, available, and willing? It was the kind of calculation that looked practical until William reportedly challenged the assumptions behind it. To him, loyalty could not be reduced to public appearances, and family stability could not be measured by how often someone stood on a balcony or attended an engagement. Trust mattered. Character mattered. So did the danger of pushing away people who might later become essential. And William's concern was not simply sentimental. He had begun to see something in Louise that others had overlooked. Her quietness, discipline, and lack of hunger for attention could make her useful to the monarchy he would one day inherit. And once William began asking why Louise was being pushed toward the edge, the discussion changed completely, because the answer forced everyone to confront a truth they had avoided for years. Louise's quietness had never meant she was insignificant. Louise had never behaved like someone waiting for royal power. That was precisely what made her valuable. She carried the name, the bloodline, the discipline, and the family connections without creating constant controversy, and William reportedly saw something others had missed. Reliability could become one of the crown's rarest assets. The more William looked at Louise's position, the harder it became to dismiss her as simply another younger royal standing at the edge of the family. She represented something the monarchy was beginning to need badly: stability without noise. She had grown up watching Edward and Sophie build their place through patience, duty, and restraint. They were not known for dramatic rebellion or public battles with the crown. Their influence came from consistency, and Louise had absorbed that example almost without trying. That mattered to William because the monarchy he would one day inherit could not survive on titles alone. It would need people who understood how the institution worked without becoming obsessed with rank, attention, or status. Louise had never shown signs of chasing any of those things. Her lower public profile, once viewed as proof that she might not be needed, could now be seen as an advantage. She carried fewer celebrity complications, fewer public feuds, and fewer expectations built around constant visibility. William reportedly began considering a different possibility. Louise did not have to become a full-time senior royal to remain useful. She could one day accept selective responsibilities, appear when the family genuinely needed her, and still protect much of the independent life she had been encouraged to build. It was a flexible role, but one that could become increasingly valuable if the working royal circle continued to shrink. Louise herself was less comfortable with the idea. Being discussed as a future asset felt strange when she had been raised to think of these people as family first. She did not want every relationship measured by what she might someday provide to the crown. And that discomfort only strengthened William's concern. In his view, younger relatives should not be punished simply because previous generations had created difficult precedents around titles, duty, and independence. He had already watched other royal relationships fracture under pressure. Departures had become public conflicts. Private resentment had turned into permanent distance. William reportedly feared that cutting Louise out before she had even chosen her own path could repeat the same pattern. Once someone was made to feel unwanted, asking them to return later could become almost impossible. Catherine quietly understood that danger. She knew how demanding royal life could become when trust was limited and every decision carried institutional weight. Keeping the door open to Louise was not about sentiment. It was about preserving a dependable relationship before the future monarchy needed it. But not everyone agreed. Another powerful voice inside the family believed William was allowing personal loyalty to interfere with necessary discipline. Kindness, in that view, could not become weakness. That disagreement would bring William directly into conflict with one of the monarchy's oldest instincts, the belief that the crown survives not by keeping everyone close, but by deciding exactly who must be kept at a distance. The argument was never supposed to become emotional. On paper, it concerned duties, funding, titles, and future responsibilities. But once Louise's name became attached to the discussion, William allegedly stopped treating it like an administrative review, because to him, removing someone who had done nothing wrong crossed a line the crown could not easily uncross. Inside the palace, the dispute had begun with cold logic. A smaller monarchy needed fewer working figures, clearer responsibilities, and less confusion about who officially represented the crown. Senior advisors could make that case without raising their voices. If the public expected a tighter royal structure, then keeping too many younger relatives close to formal duties could look unnecessary. Louise, with her quiet life and limited public role, appeared easy to place outside that future. But William saw the danger hidden inside that argument. If the family pushed people away whenever they seemed unnecessary, how could it expect them to return without resentment when circumstances changed? That question made the discussion uncomfortable. William reportedly believed exclusion left scars, especially inside a family where private hurt had a history of becoming public conflict years later. The monarchy could not keep treating relationships like doors that opened and closed whenever convenient. Once someone was made to feel unwanted, loyalty could not simply be summoned back on command. Edward found himself trapped in the middle. As Louise's father, he wanted to defend her. But as a senior royal, He knew any forceful intervention could be interpreted as demanding privilege for his own child. That restraint made Sophie's position even more emotional. She had reportedly spent years teaching Louise that discretion mattered, that service mattered, and that staying away from drama would always count for something. Now the family seemed to be considering whether that very quietness made Louise easier to remove. Louise was not told everything at once. Instead, pieces of the dispute reportedly reached her slowly, creating an even deeper sense of uncertainty. She knew conversations were happening. She knew her future was part of them, but she did not fully understand why. And then came the question that changed the tone completely. Had she done something wrong? William reportedly rejected that idea immediately. Louise's behavior was not the problem. Her loyalty was not the problem. The real problem was that nobody had clearly decided what younger royals were supposed to become. Were they expected to build independent lives and stay away? Remain available as reserve members of the family? Or prepare for service if the crown needed them later? That uncertainty had finally become impossible to ignore. And there was only one person who could turn the debate into a lasting decision. And when the question finally reached Charles, Louise's future stopped being a disagreement between advisors and became something far more dangerous, a test of whether the king's vision for a smaller monarchy could survive contact with his own family. Charles had spent years preparing for a monarchy that would need to appear leaner, more modern, and easier to defend. But Louise's case exposed the weakness inside that plan. It was one thing to speak about reducing the royal circle in theory. It was another to look at a loyal young relative and decide she no longer had a place. For Charles, the issue reached far beyond one member of the family. He had to think about public trust, the cost of royal life, the number of people carrying official duties, and whether the institution still looked relevant in a changing country. A smaller working monarchy could be easier to explain and easier to manage, but Louise complicated that logic because there was no scandal attached to her name, no rebellion, no public attack on the crown, no obvious reason to shut the door. Removing a controversial figure could be defended as protecting the institution. Removing someone quiet and dutiful raised a much harder question. What exactly was being punished? William reportedly seized on that weakness. He was not demanding that Louise become a senior working royal. He was arguing for flexibility. Keep the path open. Allow her to build her own life, but do not make a permanent decision before anyone knows what the monarchy may need years from now. Charles understood the argument, yet he also saw the danger. If Louise remained an option, other relatives might later expect the same treatment. A flexible system could quickly become an unclear one, and uncertainty was exactly what Charles had been trying to remove. Anne's view was far colder. Royal duty, as she saw it, should exist because the crown required service, not because a family member wanted recognition. There could be no automatic role simply because someone had royal blood. Sophie reportedly pushed back against that idea, insisting Louise had never asked for recognition in the first place. That was what made the debate so painful. Louise was being judged for an ambition she had never shown. And Louise herself was becoming increasingly frustrated. She had started as a young woman, quietly building an independent future. Now she had become a symbol in a larger argument about succession, duty, and the future shape of the monarchy. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what she should become, except Louise. In the end, Charles reportedly stopped short of closing the door. There would be no promise of a grand title, no guaranteed public position, and no sudden elevation. But there would also be no irreversible decision removing Louise from future consideration. It was not a victory in the dramatic sense. It was an uneasy pause. For William, however, that pause mattered. Louise would at least be allowed to decide her own path before the institution decided it for her. Yet the damage had already begun, because she now understood just how close that choice had come to being taken away. William had protected the possibility of Louise's future, but he could not protect her from discovering how uncertain her place had been, and that knowledge would quietly change the way she saw the crown itself. Protection did not bring Louise relief in the way William expected. It brought questions. Why had her place needed defending at all? Who had believed she was expendable? And if belonging inside the royal family could disappear through a private decision, what exactly had she spent her entire childhood preparing herself to respect? At first, Louise reportedly felt grateful. William had stepped into a dispute that did not directly threaten his own position and argued that her future should not be decided without her. But gratitude was mixed with something harder to ignore. If William had needed to defend her, then someone else had believed she could be pushed aside. That knowledge stayed with her. It changed the meaning of loyalty, because Louise had grown up believing that patience, good behavior, and respect for royal boundaries created a certain kind of security. Now she was discovering that institutions do not always reward people simply because they follow the rules. Slowly, Louise began separating two things she had once treated as the same: loving her family and trusting the monarchy. She could still care deeply about Charles, William, Catherine, Anne, and the relatives who had shaped her life. But the crown was something different. It was a system. Systems made decisions. Systems protected themselves. And sometimes those decisions could hurt the very people expected to serve them. That realization made Louise more cautious about her own future. If royal duty was ever offered to her, she would no longer accept it simply because tradition expected obedience. Sophie reportedly urged her not to turn temporary pain into a permanent decision. Hurt could distort judgment, and Louise still deserved the chance to decide what kind of life she wanted once the emotion had settled. Edward's advice was more restrained. Monarchy, he reminded her, had never promised constant appreciation. Service often meant accepting uncomfortable compromises without applause. But William took a different approach. He did not ask Louise to prove her loyalty. He did not demand gratitude for intervening. He simply wanted her to understand that one internal battle should not define everything she believed about the family. Catherine quietly became part of that bridge. She reportedly understood the fear of entering a rigid system and wondering whether personal independence could survive inside it. Her message to Louise was simple in spirit. Closeness to the future king did not require surrendering an independent identity. That opened another possibility. Louise could build a life largely outside formal royal duty while remaining available when family responsibility genuinely called. She did not have to choose between complete withdrawal and total service. But that compromise had only existed in private conversations. Soon, Louise would be placed in a situation where everyone could see exactly where she stood. Because once the palace placed Louise back into a visible royal setting, everyone would be watching for the answer to the question William had fought to keep open. Was she still standing inside the crown's future, or merely visiting it? The next major gathering seemed ordinary from the outside, but for Louise it carried a private meaning nobody in the crowd could fully understand. Every position, introduction, conversation, and gesture now felt different, because she knew that months earlier, powerful people had been quietly debating whether she should have any place there at all. For Louise, the occasion was no longer just another family appearance. She now understood how carefully royal hierarchy was managed, and that knowledge changed everything. A place in the room could signal acceptance. A small introduction could suggest importance. Even ordinary moments carried weight because she knew the institution rarely did anything without considering what it might mean. What once felt natural now felt calculated, and Louise could not ignore the question beneath it all. Was she there because the family wanted her, or because William had refused to let the door close? William reportedly handled the moment carefully. He did not draw attention to Louise or make her inclusion look like a dramatic victory. Instead, he treated her presence as normal. That restraint mattered. Catherine followed the same approach, offering warmth without making Louise appear protected, promoted, or singled out. Together, they seemed determined to make one point clear. Louise did not need to be displayed as a special case in order to belong. Behind that calm, however, advisors remained cautious. Greater visibility could easily be interpreted as a change in royal status, and nobody wanted one gathering to create expectations the palace had not formally approved. Louise seemed to understand that danger as well. She did not chase attention. She did not behave as though William's support had given her new authority. She asked for no title, no special recognition, and no promise about what came next. Ironically, that restraint strengthened William's case. The very qualities that had once made Louise easy to overlook now made her appear dependable. She could stand close to the institution without trying to make herself the center of it. Charles reportedly noticed the significance of that balance. He was not simply watching Louise. He was watching William, and perhaps recognizing that his son's future monarchy could operate differently. William seemed willing to preserve strict hierarchy while still leaving room for people who had earned trust. Anne remained more measured. She neither opposed Louise nor treated the moment as proof of anything permanent. In her view, future service could only be tested through action, not sentiment. For Louise, though, the deeper realization was finally becoming clear. William had not preserved a privilege for her. He had preserved her right to choose before the crown chose for her. That understanding would stay with her long after the gathering ended, and eventually it would become the reason she could no longer remain completely silent about what had happened. And when Louise finally chose to explain what William had done, she was not merely revealing a family kindness, she was exposing a struggle over what the monarchy intends to become when William is the one making the final decisions. Louise's most important revelation was not that William had saved her from humiliation. It was that he had challenged the idea that royal people could be quietly removed from the future without being given a voice. And behind that intervention was a warning about the kind of king William may eventually become. When Louise spoke of being protected, she was not describing William shielding her from gossip, criticism, or an embarrassing public moment. The protection was deeper than that. He had reportedly stopped a permanent decision from being made before Louise had been given any real chance to decide what she wanted for herself. He had not promised her a title. He had not offered a salary, a senior position, or some guaranteed place beside the future monarch. What he defended was far simpler, and perhaps far more important, her right to choose, her dignity inside the family, and the possibility that one day she might decide to serve. That changed the way Louise reportedly viewed him. William was no longer simply the cousin who happened to stand closest to the throne. He became someone who seemed to understand what it felt like to have the institution making choices around you while expecting you to remain calm. And William had reasons to understand that danger. He had already watched relationships between the crown and younger members of the family collapse under years of resentment, unclear expectations, and conversations that came too late. That history mattered. William reportedly did not want another generation growing up believing they were valuable only when the palace suddenly needed them. If Louise was pushed away now, then summoned years later during a shortage of trusted royals, why should anyone assume she would return without bitterness? It was a very different instinct from older royal thinking. Traditionally, certainty came first. Hierarchy was protected, duty was defined, and personal feelings were expected to adjust around it. William did not appear ready to destroy that system, but he seemed determined to consider the emotional cost before making permanent choices. Charles reportedly understood what that difference could mean. Father and son both wanted to protect the monarchy, but William's version of protection might involve keeping certain doors open longer than Charles would. Louise, however, still had not decided how much royal responsibility she would ever accept. William's intervention had preserved her options, but it had not erased the hurt. She still knew people had once considered a future without her, and that created a much bigger problem. If William was prepared to challenge an internal decision for Louise, others could eventually wonder whether boundaries around them might also be reconsidered. Because protecting Louise was easy compared with the choices still waiting for William, and sooner or later, the future king would face a family crisis where preserving one person's place might threaten the stability of the crown itself. Lady Louise's story appears to be about one young royal nearly pushed beyond the edge of the institution. But underneath it lies something far larger. William is inheriting not only a crown, but a family already divided by old wounds, and every person he protects may redefine what his monarchy becomes. Louise's case became an early lesson in just how difficult William's future could be. Family decisions inside the monarchy are never simply private. A cousin can also be a royal figure. A personal kindness can become an institutional signal. And a decision made to protect one person can create expectations for many others. William's defense of Louise suggested that he wanted clearer boundaries, but not cruel ones. He appeared willing to accept that the monarchy needed structure, while rejecting the idea that structure had to mean pushing people away without warning. Louise was, in many ways, the easier test. She had not publicly attacked the institution. She had not demanded a senior role or tried to force her way into royal life. Her loyalty had been quiet, which made compassion easier to defend. But William would not always face cases this simple. Other relationships carried deeper resentment, public accusations, broken trust, and political consequences. In those moments, protecting a person could come at a direct cost to the crown. Charles understood that dilemma because he had lived it. Protecting the monarchy often meant making choices that damaged the family, while protecting the family could weaken the clear authority the institution depended upon. Anne represented the older answer to that problem. Service first, recognition second. Feelings never allowed to control the structure. Catherine seemed to represent something closer to William's emerging instinct. The hierarchy would remain firm, but the emotional consequences would be considered before doors were permanently closed. Louise ultimately appeared to choose neither complete royal immersion nor total withdrawal. Her future remained open. She could build her own life while still leaving room for duty if the moment ever felt right. And that was perhaps William's real victory. He had not decided her destiny for her. He had given her time. But the experience had changed Louise. She could no longer assume that belonging inside the royal world was automatic simply because she had been born into it. At the same time, she now knew that at least one future monarch believed belonging should not be removed casually. That leaves William with a question far bigger than Louise. Can he build a monarchy strong enough to enforce boundaries without repeating the fractures that have already scarred the family? Or will every act of protection eventually force him to choose between the people he loves and the institution he is destined to lead? because Lady Louise may have been the first person to discover how fiercely William will defend someone he believes has been treated unfairly, but she almost certainly will not be the last. And next time the person asking for protection may carry consequences capable of dividing the monarchy all over again.